I think we can slowly start with the panel 3. My name is Shalva Debisashvili. I'm the professor of the University of Georgia in Political Science and International Relations. Many of you know me under a different name, Lasha, so don't be surprised. If you want to become my friend, you better call me Lasha than Shal. So this panel, I would like to invite, first of all, the panelists, and let me individually invite them. First of all, let me name Dr. Stefan Kroll, who is the head of the science communication and a senior research fellow of one of the biggest German research center, PRIF. Please, welcome. A good friend of mine, Nikolaos Vashakidze, who excellent expert, former deputy former minister. Well, he was also deputy defense minister and walking institutional memory of Georgia. Let me invite also Nino Kuchianidze, who is the peace studies researcher, lecturer, practitioner, and also a good asset of the University of Georgia in conflict studies. Welcome here, my panel. And of course, a long friend of mine from my former life, past life as a professional in defense and military, Dr. Robert Hamilton. Now he holds a research professor at Eurasian Studies, Strategic Studies Institute, U.S. Army War College, but a good friend of mine in the period when the Georgia started, actually its democratic transformation, 2006, 2008? Yeah. Exactly. So with this session, you read the description of the conference. We intend to finalize the conclusions of each of working panels. We are, none of us is a Nostradamus, so we cannot predict in a long run what will happen and what will even happen in the next day, so tomorrow. But we still have some intellectual capacity to analyze some factors, some processes, and come up perhaps with some options for policy solutions. And it is critical for us to combine all the suggestions and all the analysis you did in your respective working groups, because the general issue we discuss is very complex. You cannot divide it into a separate like areas and proceed separate, like in military area, kind of conflict area, or political economic area. Everything is interconnected. So from that perspective, we think that we have to have a discussion between you, first of all. You will present your findings in your respective working group. You have also full right and authority to ask the question to each other. And of course, once we are more or less done with each other in our internal fight, the audience is more than welcome and invited to enter the Q&A session. And of course, once our group representatives conclude their remarks, I also invite Robert to make your contribution, to provide us with your assessment and your analysis. So I'll start with the group number 1. Stefan, this is your group, and the floor is yours.
It's working now. Yeah, thank you, Lasha, for a great introduction. And thanks, first of all, to the University of Georgia and the Security Platform for organizing this and bringing us all together. This was really great experience in the morning, the first session that set the scene for the working groups. And we had the working group together with Dr. Rimidas Baltaduonis, Revas Tupuria, and Megi Benia, and a wonderful audience on the topic of European security architecture after the war. So this after the war is a challenge, of course. You mentioned that it's very difficult to look into the future, and we as analysts, experts, academics are reluctant to do so usually, and are also very careful with our recommendations, but we tried our best to face this challenge. And the main question is how this after the war is meant, right? So because, as we know, when a war takes longer than 1 or 2 years, it probably lasts for a long time, like a decade or so. So does this after mean So it's now ongoing, and we are looking for policy recommendations here, or are we really looking at what happens after this war ends at some point in time that we do not know yet? And we have answers to both, actually. So what was kind of surprising for me, so when you put 4 academics on a panel, it's usually very difficult to find some kind of agreement. So it was in the beginning, I was like, okay, I'm the one having the responsibility to bring this all together, and my usual experience would be impossible. But what was possible here, and this is remarkably, I think, that we could agree on some diagnosis of the situation here. So, and first of all is that, of course, this war is not the result, not the reaction of some kind of whatever NATO enlargement or security interests of Russia. So the agenda is different. So and this is a very important precondition to have this agreement, because based on this you can come to other solutions or to other lessons learned. So it was also very important in our panel to mark some lessons that we should learn from the past. So we talked about the deficits of Budapest, of Bucharest, and all these tries to find security guarantees with outside the NATO alliance. But before I come to the security guarantees in the long term, because this is, I mean, it's one of the pressing questions of the near future. So the Vilnius summit. So this is not looking in the future far ahead, but this is important now in a situation where we just don't know how this war will end at some point. But in terms of how to create a peace and a permanent peace, so the long-term questions, we agreed that it is, of course, and here I can refer also to the keynote in the very beginning, that the rule of law has to be strengthened again, and with regard to that war, justice is needed pretty much to get to a stable peace. So we need we need prosecution of war crimes. We also need to follow up on the idea to have an ad hoc court or with regard to the crime of aggression. So this is very important at the beginning, but also, and this is a more general point, we also need credibility and trust of all international actors, including especially also the Western ones, when it gets to the international rule of law and following international rules, also in Western interventions, for example. So we touched here also upon the more for the larger crisis of international liberal order as such. Second point, with regard to create long-term peace here, is of course a question of reconstruction, also of how to manage the crisis with environmental damage here. This is of course also very important. But of course, the core question of our debate also with the audience was how to get to long-term security strategies, and we had a wonderful presentation on the deficits in the past, but also on the chances and the diagnosis also here, and I think we also agreed. So what did work in the past empirically was being a member of NATO. This guaranteed security. What did not work so well was being not a member, but somehow connected or affiliated to NATO. So one of the lessons learned, one of the recommendations to which we came at the end in our discussion is that NATO membership is something that should be supported for Ukraine, and we also discussed the case for Georgia as well in our session. In addition to it, and this was an idea by Mehdi, after the war comes to an end at some point, so in addition to idea of NATO membership, in addition to plans of that you can read in the Kiev Security Compact, which are also important, is also what are new institutions in a political science way of thinking of it, not in a legal way of thinking of it, in the future that might be necessary. So we did not only discuss in the institutional setting that we have to use for the future, but also what could be new ideas, and here the idea of an additional joint paper agreement, however you would like to call it, legally binding for the Black Sea region to secure securities here in the future with NATO members as co-signatories, as a lessons learned of the past, where we had this kind of agreements where also Russia was a co-signature, which is of course impossible today and not part of that idea. Last point, which was important in our discussion, of course, is how Western states, Europe, can increase the immunity with regard to economy, but also the democracy of such. So Russia weaponized everything from history over interdependencies, energy, information. So it's very important to find new strategies here from education to other resources. To de-risking is what we discuss in Germany right now. So we won't decouple, because this is, I think, is a major difference to the Cold War situation, that globalization went so far that the interdependencies are so deep that decoupling is not really an option. We need to de-risk. So how can we get immune? How can we increase immunity? How can we de-risk? So these were the major points, and I will leave it here and look forward to the results of the other groups and then to the discussion. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I have already a couple of questions, but I reserve myself to Q&A session, and I will turn to Nick. He was the mediator and facilitator of the group 2, which deals with the crucial issue of the role of Russia in the post-Soviet area, the future of Russia, general the post-Soviet area. And we all know that whatever happens with Russia and however the war ends in Ukraine, Russia will not disappear immediately. So geography is still there. So somehow we have to kind of deal with Russia in one or another way. So your perspective, your analysis in your group is, I think, not less relevant than the first group. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Lasha. First of all, I would like to thank you very much. Thank very much the distinguished speakers of our group who made a very interesting contribution in this extremely difficult topics. Madam Dalia Bankauskaite, Dr. John Kennedy, and Mr. Konstantin Yoseliani. And of course, we are very thankful to the audience who was very active and interesting and enriched the discussion very well. Well, we agreed from the very beginning that the topic, which is, it already outlined the Russia and post-Soviet space, but actually the discussion was mainly concentrated on the future of Russia, what Russia is going to be after the war in Ukraine. And we realized that this particular issue is probably one of the most important, but at the same time, very vague, which is very difficult to analyze or give some prognosis or predictions. But anyway, the common understanding was that first of all, the main goal all of this war now in Russia for Ukraine and the democratic community is to achieve victory for Ukraine in this war and restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity, and simply to say restoration of justice at its at least minimal level. But at the same time, the not least issue and problem is to have such kind of post-war world or post-war Europe, which would allow us to feel more secure than we do it right now, and to provide all necessary conditions to don't make this sort of things happen in the future. And here, with this task, the main topic of our discussion is in a very direct connection. So it simply means that what kind of Russia we'll have after this war then it would affect the security situation. It was the main factor for the security situation, at least in Europe, in future. And here, of course, we try to analyze what are options and chances for those for future Russia after the war. When we discussed option of a more or less democratic Russia after this war, of course it is the most favorable option or version of development. But we had to acknowledge that the potential of having this sort of state, at least in its current borders for Russia, looks quite problematic. And here was the very interesting discussion, and one of the, I think, strongest arguments is that if we compare some historical parallels, and comparisons are very important in this regard. For example, when we received Russian Federation after dissolution of Soviet Union in the beginning of 90s, it was a real and quite a big and strong potential for democracy in that Russia at that time, because all of us remember that last period of Soviet Union was so-called perestroika and democratization period, where the vast majority of Russian population was pro-democracy minded. Democratic institutions like political parties and public organizations, international engagement, and so on and so forth was very strong in that society, which allowed to have more or less democratic Russia at least for a decade after the dissolution of Soviet Union. Anyway, having this sort of potential, this democratic development was lost. And finally, we received this Putin Russia, which made the sort of ugly things which all of us are witnessing now. If we take current Russia, the potential for democracy, pro-democratic moods or forces in Russia and so on are much, much weaker than it was in Russia in the beginning of 90s, which makes the option for post-war democratic Russia quite problematic. And plus to this, the problem here is that during last years, and especially 1.5 years when this war started in Ukraine, quite a big amount of Russian population left this country, escaping the war and all of these ugly developments in that country. And unfortunately, we had to acknowledge that the vast majority of people who left the country are those who are pro-democracy and pro-normalcy oriented, which simply would weakness much more chances for democratic development after the war, because we have to confess that a big part of this people, of this population, I would say vast majority, would not return to Russia immediately after the war, and so would not be able to affect situation and developments. And quite a big part maybe would not return at all, because, you know, along the years, people to settle themselves in a more favorable situation and conditions and so on. And if so, the options for non-optimistic, or so to say pessimistic developments of post-war Russia are quite high, especially if we take into account that the simply formula is that, of course, the goal and the projection is the dissolution of Putin's regime, but dissolution of Putin's replacement of Putin's regime is not necessarily better one, and it quite possibly be much worse in its nature, because we see what kind of political ideologies or structures now have been developing in current Russia along this war. We see this bunch of so-called private military companies, which are simply illegal armies, which probably are going to clash to divide the wealth and power in the country, and what Russia would turn in as a result of this clash also looks very problematic. And we see that the as a kind of replacement for Putin's regime and Putin's regime's ideology, we see such kind of people like a new sort of empire for Russia, or a more fascist kind of ideology, and strengthening the forces who represent this sort of ideology. So it is a real threat. Now the question is how this sort of Russia then would affect its neighborhood. And of course it is not good news for neighborhood to have such kind of a big neighbor. Good news here is that, as if I'm not mistaken, Madame Dalia put very correctly, that the attempt of Russia to create alternative units in post-Soviet space, like engaging with Central Asian states and so on, in big part failed. We still have formally CSTO, so-called Eurasian Economical Union and so on, but today we can witness that all of these developments and influence of Russia on those regions are quite minimized and shrinking. We witnessed that, for example, such a long-standing partner and ally of Russia like Armenia in Caucasus dramatically changed its political orientation quite recently. We see that Russia as a leader or dominant country in Central Asia is being replaced by China. So, of course, this post-war Russia might be even having even uglier regime than current one, but it probably might have less leverage to negatively affect the neighborhood, but it's still quite fragile guarantee anyway. So the vagueness, unpleasant vagueness is ahead, and that's why the task is very clear, to have a clear concept and vision, and then of course coming out from this vision the strategy and even tactics on how to deal with Russia, how to affect processes in Russia to receive at least minimally bad developments there, and to receive more or less tolerable situation for neighborhood to build normal European security architecture. So the another conclusion which we made was that regardless of what kind of Russia will receive, new security architecture for this big sub-region, for Europe, and for this post-Soviet region needs to be built anyway. Otherwise, it would mean that we'll have no more or less positive result after this sort of casualties and effort spent. And here we realized, and it appeared during the Q&A session, that what was done before as a framework for European security architecture is almost destroyed in its big part. we see that OSCE became just absolutely non-effective due to Russian efforts. Such kind of a guarantee for European security, like for example CFE treaty, is not existing anymore, also by Russian actions. We see all major principles violated, like territorial integrity, the prohibition of any kind of solution of political problems by military means, which simply means aggression and so on. All of these things are destroyed. But anyway, the new architecture is going to be built on some simple, understandable and strong principles, which we appear to find that is already being done. And it is a principle of territorial integrity and immunity of state borders. And if, for example, this principle was in sort of under some question, for example, in the period of beginning of war in Ukraine, when many scholars or even politicians of high rank were considering kind of settlement of this conflict by sort of territorial concessions to Russia. Now it is completely taken out, and the principle of territorial integrity looks like the cornerstone of a future European security architecture, and we see how it was strongly defended and preserved in the Caucasus when Armenia, after more than 3 decades of having different positions, now recognizes the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan in its internationally recognized borders. We see that all rhetorics of politicians around the future of Ukraine is based on the clear keeping of its territorial integrity in the borders of 1991. And of course, this principle then would go to other countries like Moldova, Georgia, and so on, which is very important here. Such another and different kind, the player of very strong and different nature, like China, is also a big defender of a principle of territorial integrity due to its own problems. And I guess it is going also to play an important role here. And so the main conclusion is that regarding the topic, that we are facing a very complex, very deep and big problem for which big part of solutions or projections of how to deal with still are not found. And there is quite a big work ahead. We mean the political, diplomatic, even scientific. So some sort of strategy is going to build. Otherwise, we might receive quite the vague and dangerous situation after the war in Ukraine. So, of course, we did have lots of other interesting discussions, but I would stop here and probably then touch some other issues in Q&A session.
Thank you, Nick, for deep analysis of the work and the conclusions done within the working group. It's very striking to me, specifically the conclusion that the likelihood of the democratic Russia is pretty minimal, because if it didn't work in early 90s with all the democratic institutions, dissidents, and etc., why it should work now, where we have even less democratic institutions, and the entirety of the democratically thinking Russians are basically outside of the Russia. That's interesting. But at the same time, it begs the questions, should it mean that the democracy has to be imposed from outside? And then this ultimately means how the military victory of Ukraine should be translated into political victory that ultimately includes Russia in all this global European security architecture. Thank you again. I'm turning to Nino. I assume the work in your working group was not less intensive and illuminating as well. So please, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Great. Yeah, so the working group that I was facilitating was on the topic of conflict resolution and post-Soviet space. And of course, because of the diverse experiences and backgrounds of the panel discussants, we also came up with a lot of interesting points and fresh perspectives. But I would also like to sort of give an introduction to what conflict resolution looks like in terms of how we view conflicts. Because when we're speaking about conflict, it's really important to acknowledge the different dimensions, aspects, parties that assess the situation of the conflict, right? So basically, we think that it's right to view the conflict in three dimensions. So the first one would be the interpower conflict between non-democratic rule and liberal democracy. So Russia versus the West. Second, and that would be the case in post-Soviet space, certainly an interstate conflict between Russia and some of the countries, including Georgia, in the post-Soviet space over the unrecognized territories or breakaway territories, such as in Georgia's case, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, right? And third, as intra-state conflict between groups within states, like in Georgia's case, it would be Georgians and ethnic Abkhaz, and Georgians and ethnic Ossetians, right? So, but which particular dimension we choose to discuss this conflict is often, it's a matter of political preference and also a demonstration of loyalty towards a certain political narrative. But still, yet for us to get a clearer picture of the situation, of course, all aspects and all dimensions must be included. And in order for us to adopt the right conflict transformation strategy, first and foremost, we have to understand what are the underlying causes and conditions, as well as to the conflict, and also all the parties who are involved in the conflict must be identified. And oftentimes, because of the preferences of certain narratives, that aspect is overlooked. So in this case, we did come up with key takeaways through our discussions, and one of them would be that you cannot really have peace without security. And here, an international community has a role to play in ensuring security, therefore promoting peace. And this includes being more open and in line through their actions of the international community to welcome aspiring countries into their space, meaning EU and NATO integration. Also, at the moment, in the current Georgian context, for instance, if we're talking about Georgia, there is no clear outline of what a strategy for conflict transformation could look like, or at least it is not really discussed widely. And it seems like the state sort of really depends on how the interpower dynamics play out. And although generally it is stated that conflict resolution and territorial integrity is important, and it's a priority. They don't really focus too much on letting us understand what we mean through conflict transformation and how we see peace and how to get there. So in the meantime, there is also limited to no interaction on the other dimensions of the conflict, which is the interstate conflict and intra-state conflict, for obvious reasons, although those reasons could seem to be obscure and not that obvious. And on the local level, the potential suggestions could include to engage more on reflective practice and critical analysis over how the conflicts have developed and where we stand and where we want to go from here in future, because that could potentially be easier to do internally rather than to wait for a political resolution to this conflict and wait for external actors to play out the games that are being played out. So basically, to open the discussion on how peace is being viewed locally. And also the prospects of conflict resolution in Georgia is very much closely linked to what will be the fate of democracy in this country. Because right now, democracy is what's at stake. And that's a thought that needs to, be discussed more. And some of the suggestions also include intensification of international support and their engagement in conflict resolution processes. For example, the European Union could potentially be more engaged in conflict transformation processes. I know they are partially through the programs that they support, but to be more explicit about it. Also promoting education for conflict transformation, and this could include peace education elements such as promoting reflective and critical thinking on topics on issues of peace and conflict. And as we know, education often poses as an enhancer of mentalities, like including war mentalities. Another point that we made was that it would be good to provide space for discussions that might not be popular at the local level. And we know that there are tabooed sort of topics because conflicts are very sensitive. It has caused trauma to majority of or at least vast numbers of population. So it's not easy for people to actually embrace and engage in discussions that would lead to alternative ways of thinking about conflict transformation prospects. But that is necessary in order for us to actually touch upon conflict resolution and transformation and peace building. And also all of this, I think, is in parallel to trusting that Ukraine, who is fighting for us all against a bully, will win this war for the sake of the common good. So that's a positive note that I sort of have. But also, I guess what I could add to this is that we don't really have too much recommendations at all. There are suggestions, but because of the complexity of conflict and the multidimensional aspect of this conflict, it seems to be difficult to actually focus on or want to focus on all of the aspects. It's either or, usually, and depending on the narratives that we feel to be more aligned with. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Was really excellent. I was struck by the notion that actually the recognition of the fact that the Georgian side has no strategy to deal with conflicts, and there's no whatsoever resolution concept, that would help Georgia whenever external factors would allow it to resolve the conflicts. And by the way, it also begs for the question: so if this tendency continues, would the external factors only be enough and sufficient, to somehow turn the situation in the favor of Georgia's territorial integrity? And with that, I turn to Robert. Given your immense military security institutional experience, not only of the U.S. but specifically of Georgia and countries Russia and South Caucasus, you will be given the first opportunity to reflect on the conclusions right now, and also add your analysis and your insights on the issues. Please, the floor is yours.
Sure. So thanks, Lasha, and thanks to UGSP for the invitation here. I've learned a lot today. I'm always happy to have a chance to come back to Georgia. So, and I'll preface my remarks by saying they're my own opinions. They don't reflect the policies or positions of the U.S. Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. So that said, yeah, from the three panels, I was able to bounce around among the working groups. I didn't see all of any of them because I could only be in one place at once, but I saw some really interesting discussion. And so, yeah, I'll do what Lasha asked. I'll sort of pass on my insights that I came to today from listening to all the panels and the working groups, and then add a little bit, maybe my own analysis or opinion. So in the first one, post-war Euro-Atlantic security architecture, I think it's clear NATO will continue to be the most prominent piece of the Euro-Atlantic security architecture. The question, as the working group and panel one actually talked about this a little too, is what's NATO's policy toward Russia? What role does Russia play in the Euro-Atlantic security architecture? I don't think there's any room for any sort of partnership with Russia. I don't see the NATO-Russia Council being reestablished anytime soon, although I've been wrong about that before. I was surprised at how short the suspension was in 2008 or after 2008. But nevertheless, it's going to be NATO. NATO will enlarge, will continue to enlarge, and Russia will probably be the main adversary of NATO, the country against which NATO membership is meant to protect. For a while, I remember, many of us remember, there was a time in the early part, after 9/11, in the early part of this century, where the NATO motto, unofficial motto, was out of area or out of business, right? The idea being that there was no threat in Europe. So NATO countries, NATO had, as an alliance, had to learn how to operate out of area in Afghanistan and other places, or it didn't have any reason to exist, right? We've moved 180 degrees from that idea now. It's all about Russia. NATO enlargement did not cause the war in Ukraine. Let's be clear about that. Okay? I mean, it just didn't. NATO, so, and for people who say it did, the John Mearsheimers and others of the world, I would offer that Russia was intervening in Georgia in 1992 and 93 in Abkhazia. Russia was intervening in Moldova and Transnistria in 1992 before anybody in NATO was talking about NATO enlargement, right? So the dependent variable can't come before the independent variable, right? That's not how these equations work. I think it's clear that in Vilnius, Ukraine will be offered a path to membership and Georgia will not. And it sort of pains me to say that, but I think that's a fact. I think since 2008, Ukraine and Georgia have been seen as a pair. I think that pair is broken, and I don't know if the break is irrevocable or not. But Georgia may get some status or some, enhanced engagement plus or something. But Ukraine's going to get a path to. I think it's likely that Ukraine is going to get a very clear path to membership, and Georgia will not be part of that. I worry a little bit in the Georgian national security and foreign policy establishment. There's the assumption that Western aid is a given and will just continue no matter what happens here in terms of democratization or Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. As an American, I can say from U.S. perspective, I think for Georgia to matter to the U.S., two conditions have to hold. Two things have to be true. Number one is what we would call the liberal internationalist foreign policy paradigm has to continue to be dominant in D.C., and it has been for decades. But there are people, and the Trump administration Trump was one, and there were others in the administration who had more of a sort of realist or pragmatist view of international relations, and that was, hey, democracy isn't all that important. International institutions aren't all that important. It's really all about power. If that paradigm were to take hold in DC, Georgia is too small, too remote, and next to Russia, and therefore it's not a core US interest. Georgia's security is not a core US security interest, right? If the realist foreign policy paradigm takes hold in DC. The second condition it has to hold is Georgia has to be seen as making progress toward democratization, right? So the liberal internationalists have to be ascendant in DC, and Georgia has to be, because they believe that democracy matters, and then Georgia has to be seen as making progress toward democratization. If those two conditions don't hold, then Georgia is an afterthought in terms of US national security policy. I hate to say that, but it's just a fact. And I think there's a growing consensus in DC, I know there is in Congress, that Georgia's democratic transition has, at a minimum, stalled, maybe reversed, right? So I'm a little worried about the future of US engagement and assistance in Georgia. I don't think it's a given. Georgia's a sovereign country, so if it chooses to go in a different direction, that's a sovereign choice. The United States and no other country is going to drag it into NATO or the EU, but you can't expect the aid to continue at the levels it has. Okay. I worry a little bit about US support for Ukraine as well for different reasons. This has everything to do with the US domestic political situation. So the latest poll I've been able to find was an Axios poll in March. So 59% of Americans support continuing to support Ukraine at the current levels, but only 42% of Republicans support that. So less than half of Republican voters in the US, those who self-identify as Republicans, support continuing to support Ukraine at the current levels. So you could see, and so the discussion on panel one this morning, I think was correct. The traditional Republican foreign policy establishment, the Lindsey Grahams and others of the world, are strongly in favor of continued support to Ukraine. But there's a MAGA wing, there's a hard right Freedom Caucus wing that's not. And so just like they had to in the recent budget deal, the debt limit deal, the Republican caucus is going to have to manage its far right wing to continue support for Ukraine at the current levels. Okay. I'll make these quicker than this first one. Post-war Russia, Nick's panel. The main thing I took from that is half measures with Russia never work, or what we call lowest common denominator policies, right? Which are common in consensus-based organizations. It's no one's first choice, but it's the only thing that everybody around the table can agree on, and it tends to be a split the difference, right? So when we split the difference on Russia, it never works. So we try to sort of split the difference at the end of the Cold War. Russia did not acknowledge it was a defeated power. We didn't treat it like a defeated power, but we also didn't give it enough aid in terms of economic aid and aid in its democratic transition so that its economic liberalization and democratic transition succeeded. They failed. So we did enough, we were engaged enough that the Russians could blame us for the failure, right? And we didn't, and they never acknowledged defeat in the Cold War. They never acknowledged that they lost the Cold War. Had it acknowledged it was a defeated power, and had it been treated by the West as a defeated power, or had the West made it a core security interest to make sure Russia succeeds, I'm not sure that was possible, by the way, but nevertheless, as a thought experiment, we may have had a different outcome. NATO enlargement is another sort of half measures never work with Russia story, I think. And the 2008 Bucharest summit was a perfect example of this, right? We split the difference on Ukraine and Georgia. So what that did was it put Russia on notice that NATO was serious about accepting these countries into the alliance, but it also notified Russia that they had no status, no protection, or anything else from the alliance in the interim. So, so Russia and the world, I think, yeah, what you've seen is the most complete rupture with the West since probably since the early Soviet period. Right? The United States didn't acknowledge the Soviet Union diplomatically until 1933. So from 1917 to 1933, maybe the rupture was more complete than it is now. But at least in my professional life, I've never seen a rupture with Russia rupture with the West as complete and as deep as this. And I don't see how it gets rebuilt anytime soon. We talked about this, the first panel did a little bit. Russia standing in the global south doesn't seem to have changed. I was in Africa last fall, September, doing research for a book project, and the people I talked to in South Africa, Ethiopia, and Kenya said, well, you know, you got to understand if people here buy the NATO enlargement as the cause of the war thing, many of them do, right? So The Russian narrative in the global south and Russia's standing in the global south doesn't seem to have changed. The China-Russia relationship does seem to have strengthened over this war. The war will be the crucible, right? If China does provide actual military aid to Russia in the war, then there's no debate about whether this is strategic partnership or not. It is. But if China continues to sit in the sidelines while providing rhetorical or narrative support to Russia, then it's a different relationship. I think it's a more instrumental relationship and not a deep sort of partnership. Finally, Putin didn't invade Ukraine, Russia did, right? Especially we in the US, like to say Putin did this, Putin did that. The latest Levada Center polls, 83% approval rating for Putin as of April. And as of this month, as of this month, 76% support the war, Russians. 43 definitely support and 33 mostly support. So yes, Putin is the leader of Russia, but this is a bigger problem than Putin, right? And then finally, how the war will end. Well, it'll end in a negotiated settlement because all wars do, right? Even World War II, the U.S. policy was unconditional surrender. We still allowed, for instance, the Japanese emperor to remain, right? We took German and Japanese sort of some of their positions into account, even while calling it an unconditional surrender. So this war will end in a negotiation. I don't see either side. I hope Ukraine has the capacity for a full military victory to all Ukrainian territory inside its 1991 borders liberated. But I think it's going to be a really, really hard thing to do. Russia has means to escalate this war that it hasn't yet used, and if it starts to lose on the ground, it can escalate. Right now, I think the calls for negotiation are very premature. Both sides believe now that they can get a better deal by fighting than negotiating. The war will end when both sides believe they can get a better deal by negotiating than fighting, right? So either one of them has to be very close to a comprehensive victory, but know that that comprehensive victory will entail more casualties, more losses, more bloodshed, and be willing to accept less than a complete victory, or they just have to exhaust each other. Finally, on the Ukrainian counteroffensive, I mean, we know it's all started, and I'd say, I'm talking mostly to us in the West, calm down, be patient, right? It was 11 months from June 6, 1944, from D-Day until the German capitulation. And Germany, by the way, was also fighting the Soviet Union at the time. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive is smaller than the D-Day invasion, but nevertheless, this is not going to be a 2-week, the war won't be over in 2 weeks. It probably won't be over in 2 months. It might not be over in 2 years. So the counteroffensive, I hope and I think will turn the tide in Ukraine's favor, but unless there's a rapid collapse of Russian resistance, which is possible, but I don't think is likely, the war won't end. And I think a rapid collapse of Russian resistance, if the Russian army literally disintegrates in Ukraine, I think then we are in the danger where the Russian military is in a situation where they have to make crisis decisions as their army is collapsing in Ukraine. You're in a position then where nuclear weapon use becomes probably possible, thinkable, right? So I'll end it there.
Thank you, Bob. We are directly jumping into a Q&A session since we have almost 17 minutes left, and I don't want to steal time from our audience. Please, formulate your question briefly, precisely, and address the respective member of the panel. Please. Levan.
So first of all, thank you for your very interesting presentation. I'm gonna address to Stefan on my first question. What do you think, or who is responsible to, or take down, or how to say, just bring to the justice the war criminals from Russia? And second question to Robert, you mentioned that there are some possibilities and Russia has ability to escalate this war. What do you see, or what your thoughts that regardless of the nuclear threat or nuclear armament used, what are the additional threats that Russia might pose to global security or even European security nowadays? Thank you.
Go ahead, Stefan.
No, it's no. Yes. Yeah, great. Thank you very much for the question. I think what is really remarkable with this ongoing war, when you compare it to other wars with major war crimes in the past, that the fact finding and the documentation has already begun. So this is a huge advantage, and of course it is a very important part in the transition to peace at some point. That there will be justice, and I think it is pretty much we've talked about what can the international community do, what kind of support, and then we also see that the isolation of Russia did not work. Yeah, in this case of justice, it must work, right? So we also have these UN General Assembly resolutions where we had huge support, and we saw some signs of isolation. And condemning what Russia is doing, and we should build on this. So the international community has to support this, and in more concrete terms. So is it just the ICC? Is it just the domestic justice? I would also argue there is necessary to have these ad hoc court for Russia, Ukraine, like that we had in the past in the case of Yugoslavia, because this is also something. Also emphasizing, in addition to the legal proceedings, so that at least in this point, yeah, the international community is still existent. Because in the other issues that we just discussed, the big question is: what is this international community? Yeah? Do we have it? And here I see the chance to have an international community engaging. So, and I would say, so this is pretty much the main responsibility of the international community.
Yeah, just so I'm sure I understand the question, so I answer the question you asked. It was conditions under which Russia is likely to use nuclear weapons, or what other threats might Russia pose to Europe absent nuclear? I'm sorry? Regardless of the nuclear threat. What other threats does Russia pose to Europe? Well, it has strategic non-nuclear weapons, right? Or non-nuclear strategic weapons. The Poseidon torpedo, Kinjal. Kinjal has been sort of taking a bit of a bloody nose now, because it turns out that Patriot, which we spent 30 years laughing at, talking about the Patriot is not as capable as we thought it was, and now it turns out it's, at least if you believe what the Ukrainians are saying, I think there's pretty good evidence for it that they've used that and maybe NASAMS as well to shoot down some hypersonic Kinjals. But Russia does have non-strategic or non-nuclear strategic weapons, right? Of those things, long-range precision strike weapons. I mean, it's going to be. So I was just recently with my Army War College students in Latvia and in Lithuania, and we had meetings with the Ministries of Defense and Ministries of Foreign Affairs there, and the MODs in both of those countries were clear. Hey, 3 to 5 years, Russia will reconstitute all the military power that it has lost in Ukraine to this point. So in 3 to 5 years, it will pose the same threat it posed at the very beginning of this war in terms of numbers, capabilities, numbers of personnel, numbers of equipment. It will reconstitute. And if it's a learning organization, it'll have learned from the war in Ukraine and be better. Again, and this is, the Baltic perspective is not always shared everywhere in NATO, right? And but we got a lot from the Latvian and Lithuanian governments. We told you so about Russia. We've been telling you this for 30 years, and you haven't been listening. So maybe you'll listen now, right? So Russia will, I think, even after Ukraine, even after if it loses in Ukraine, I think it's more likely that it will lose. I don't see any way it can win. It certainly can't achieve its initial goals. It failed, and it can't. There's no way it can control all of Ukraine. It doesn't have the capacity. I don't even think it can control the 5 provinces in Ukraine that it's formally annexed. It doesn't have the capability to control and hold those, so it can't win. But whether it loses or how it loses, it will still probably within half a decade or a decade have reconstituted and pose a threat.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Nino?
Hello, everybody. And thank you for this very, very interesting discussion, though not easy to accept, but you are people here who are not afraid of the reality. And that's the reality that that recently I hear more and more often from Georgia's partners that they will never do Georgia's homework. It is impossible. Nobody will drag Georgia into the EU or NATO, and that it's our job to do. And thank you for that truth, to be reminded. So, but still, Mr. Vashakidze, you said that everybody should take care of that the same doesn't happen again, meaning the war which is going on in Ukraine. But until ensuring that same not to happen, the war should be ended, and Ukraine should win. And between war, ended war, and let's hope, I don't know, until Georgia enters the NATO, there is also a period of time that something may happen every day, starting from today till the membership. So how do you see, if you see any ways strengthening Georgia's security and capacity to defend itself? Because what I've heard also recently, not once, but several times also, that if Georgia chooses some, and Robert Hamilton said the same actually, if Georgia chooses some other way, decides to secure itself or something, nobody can force the country to do something else and go towards NATO. So how do you see the perspective of Georgia strengthening its defense capabilities and its security? I know, hopeless question kind of, but still, thank you. My name is Nino Gelashvili. I'm a journalist from the Radio Free Europe. Thank you.
Both to Nick and Bob,
Yes,
I
please.
assume, right?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Well, I'll try not to let my frustration show. It was a great question. Frustration stems from the fact that Georgia has been working on a national defense strategy since 2019. Two of the people in this room, one on this stage and another one in the audience, were integral parts of that. It's still not published. Georgia has had a total defense concept, which is, by the way, Dyla can tell everyone that total defense, societal resilience are the only way for small countries to survive against bigger neighbors. You can't win a conventional war against Russia, full stop. Georgia cannot. It's impossible. So at some point, you have to transition from a conventional to an unconventional strategy and fight an insurgency. And the entire government, the entire society, the economy, everything has to be engaged in the war effort, right? This is the poisoned shrimp scenario, right? Singapore, you may ingest me, but you can't digest me because I'll poison you, right? Frankly, Georgia just has not made much progress on that front for political, I guess, political reasons. I don't quite understand it. But this is a 4-year-old effort that has produced nothing, no strategy, no published, nothing published and official. Georgia's defense spending is dipped below 2% now, right? You can say, okay, you know, Germany's is below, yeah, but Germany's a NATO member. You're not going to get kicked out of NATO for spending less than 2% on defense, but you probably won't get in, right? Because that's the 2014 Wells Summit target, 2%. So to survive, I think Georgia needs to take, this is the Article 3 discussion. We all fixate on Article 5, but, you know, but Article 3 is important for candidate countries because Article 3 is about resilience and self-defense. You have to show the capacity to defend yourself, and you have to build societal resilience for NATO to take you seriously as a candidate country. Like, for a long time, Georgia was doing that. They were making progress in that direction. And since, I don't know, 2019, early 2020, progress has stalled or reversed. So those are the things, I think it's pretty clear what candidate countries, especially small ones, need to do. Yeah, why it's not happening, I don't have a good answer for.
I'm risking to put my answer in a political way, or to be too political, but as we agreed to speak in a direct and opening to tell truth to each other, I think it will not be political. It's an expert's view, which might look political. You very properly catch this very important moment of sort of gap, which we don't know how long it would last, starting from the end of the war and certain period of time when some sort of strengths will start to be gained in Russia, or if I catch correctly your thought. Yeah, this would be really, I think, a window of opportunity for Georgia and window of threat at the same time. But I'm afraid that this window of opportunity would go in vain if current government in Georgia would remain in power. And that's why my personal view is that the critical point and critical task for Georgian society for today is to do its best for Georgia to have much more professional and open-minded, or even patriotic, if you like, government by that period of time. Otherwise, we might fail in our aspirations.
Thank you, Nick. We still have three questions, and then I fear I have to block it. First, Temo, then was the gentleman in the last row, and you, sir. Yeah, so Temo first. Microphone.
First of all, thanks all speakers for interesting meeting and discussion. I'm Temur Sherbakov, student of political sciences at the University of Georgia. I have one question to Robert. How Georgian accession in NATO depends on desire of other South Caucasian countries? That's my question.
I will collect, and then please, sir, in the last row.
Integrate in NATO.
Hello again, John from NATO. Not from NATO, from RAND. Been thinking about NATO, obviously. We've been talking a lot about Russia's the decline of Russia. I've been talking about it myself. We've been talking about the counteroffensive in Ukraine. I wonder whether it's useful to think about Russia's capabilities, given what's happened at the dam over the next few weeks, in terms of just purely sowing chaos in Ukraine. I'm concerned that the dam was so proximate to Zaporizhia that that's indicative of Russia's intent to really go turn the screw and to set the scene in Ukraine where everything is on fire. And I'm not quite sure how we respond to that. And I wonder whether the panel would have any ideas, or whether just tell me I'm mad.
Great idea. You're definitely not mad. And the gentleman. And this is the last question. We have to finish with this question. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Irakli Sirbiladze, a researcher based in Georgia. So my question will go to Professor Hamilton. So let's just imagine the hypothetical that Georgia is going to get the membership action plan in the coming NATO summit. So is Russia going to do anything about it, or is capable of doing anything about it, given the military capabilities due to the war in Ukraine? Thanks.
Okay, we have three questions. I think the first question pretty much relates about the South Caucasus context of the NATO integration of Georgia, specifically given this idea of 3+3, which excludes any European kind of involvement in the region. So this is, and then definitely the question about the Russians turning totally crazy in Ukraine, sowing chaos, etc., etc. And yes, the last questions, gentlemen, please free, and ladies, sure, please free to respond to questions.
I guess real quickly on the first one, I don't think Georgia's NATO membership prospects are tied in any way to those of preferences or prospects of Armenia or Azerbaijan. Georgia was tied very closely to Ukraine since 2008, and like I said, I think that tie is broken. They were seen as a pair, and Georgia was actually seen as leading the pair for a long, long time. On the John, yeah, so the people who say, you know, well, the Russians wouldn't blow up the dam, it doesn't make sense. These are many of the same people who said Russia's not going to invade Ukraine, it wouldn't make sense. Or if they do, it's going to be, and I was one who thought this, it's going to be a limited operation focused on eastern Ukraine with maybe some long-range strikes on Ukrainian military facilities elsewhere in the country. So a full-scale invasion of Ukraine designed to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine is an insane undertaking. It makes no sense. Well, they did it, right? So I'm fairly skeptical on Russia, and I've still managed to be disappointed so many times over the last 20 years or so that there's almost nothing I don't put past them. I think it's very possible, yeah.
Other comments from your side?
I think we agree on that point. So the whole story, how it went, so there is no reason to think that to put anything off the table, right? But there was the other question with regard to how Russia might react when it now starts with NATO. I would not expect any immediate response. It really depends, I think, on the path that will be taken and what the other scenarios then will be to provide security. And there are different options and there are different possible reactions, but in the immediate moment, I wouldn't expect anything to happen. That could be one of those paths, but it's not. It's just one option. So yeah, and also depends on how you interpret Article 5 then. So I think it's open now. What will be the scenario then? But because there are some risks. But I think before it comes to that point, there's also the political point within the NATO member states. So will they agree on that or on that variant to do it? So I think it pretty much depends on that, what will happen.
Sure.
A really quick thing to your sowing chaos question, John. So war crimes are a feature, not a bug of Russian military strategy, right? These aren't accidents. You heard, what did we hear? What was the number? 60,000, I think, this morning? Whatever the number is, they're an integral part of Russian military strategy because the calculus is war crimes are a shortcut to achieving military success. They make our chances of victory higher, and as long as we win the war, nobody's going to The Hague. It worked in Chechnya, it's worked in Syria, hasn't worked in Ukraine yet. They haven't won the war, they haven't lost it either, and the war crimes are a part of their strategy. They're built into the strategy. So more war crimes, absolutely, and then more of this, just sowing chaos. I mean, they could flood. There are other dams they could bomb. There are all other things they could bomb.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, all the members of the panel. I think we have some takeaway from this panel. We have some conclusions that Russia is still a factor. It will remain, and we will have to deal with Russia. And there will be a huge issue with the Russian democracy in the future, definitely. NATO will remain as a major security actor, and it depends actually on Georgia how the homework will be done, because there is no automatic or automatismus that once we declare that we want to join NATO, NATO will, as you said, drag us into NATO, although we actually no longer kind of express our desire to join it politically, at least on the political level. And yes, thank you for your insight that the for the conflict resolution, specifically dimensions, that there are different dimensions that you have to deal simultaneously to reach lasting solutions for the conflict. That if there is no strategy on the Georgian side, external factors not necessarily lead immediately to the conflict resolution. Thank you to you all. Thank you to the entire UGSP team, and specific thanks goes to our student behind. I'm sure they're not, some of them missed classes. I'm sure they're happy about that, but I greatly appreciate your support. Thank you again, and these are the next young generation of Georgian politicians and diplomats, etc. So look at them; they're gorgeous, right? So thank you again to all you, to all you participants of the panel. You really for your patience, first of all, you need. And I invite you to your standing, I don't know, cocktails, dinner, whatever we call it, outside, and we can continue our chat and Q&A session outside. Thank you again.